And I know you have a plane, so you know.
They want to listen to the story.
Okay, next, again, I apologize. Why don't you go ahead so he can hear? Thank you.
I will not hear your story.
Kính thưa quý vị, trong Ủy hội Nhân quyền Lantos, tôi là Trần Thị Ngọc Minh. Hôm nay tôi có mặt ở đây để trình bày câu chuyện về người con gái út của tôi là Đỗ Thị Minh Hạnh, 28 tuổi, một tù nhân lương tâm tại Việt Nam. Chỉ vì giúp đỡ những công nhân khốn khổ, những nông dân bị Cộng sản cướp đất, cướp nhà, mà con tôi bị nhà cầm quyền Cộng sản Việt Nam bắt giam vào tù.
Members of the Lantos Human Rights Commission, I'm Trần Thị Ngọc Minh. I'm grateful to be here today to speak about my daughter, our youngest child, Đỗ Thị Minh Hạnh, 28 years old, who's also a prisoner of conscience. And she became prisoner of conscience simply because she was helping the poor factory workers and assisting farmers whose lands and homes were wrongly expropriated by the Vietnamese Communist government.
Có lẽ quý vị ngồi đây, tại nước Mỹ này, quý vị không thể biết hết tình cảnh của công nhân tại Việt Nam. Những người trực tiếp làm ra của cải, trong đó có những hàng hóa do họ làm ra được bán sang Hoa Kỳ. Họ đã sống và làm việc trong những điều kiện hết sức tồi tệ. Họ cư trú trong những khu nhà thiếu tiện nghi, mất vệ sinh, chật chội. Có hàng trăm vụ công nhân bị ngộ độc thực phẩm từ bữa ăn do công ty xí nghiệp cung cấp. Họ phải làm việc từ 12 đến 15 giờ mỗi ngày, nhưng chỉ được trả lương bình quân $70 mỗi tháng. Nhiều trường hợp bị chủ không trả lương, không đóng bảo hiểm, sa thải khi ốm đau, gặp tai nạn lao động thì không bồi thường đầy đủ. Họ không được quyền thành lập công đoàn riêng để bảo vệ cho mình.
Perhaps as you sit here in the United States of America, you do not know fully the conditions of the factory workers in Vietnam, those who created wealth, including commodities such as shoes, clothes, and other merchandises which were sold to America. They have to work in abysmal conditions and live in slums and unsanitary housings. There have been hundreds of cases of food poisoning as the employers provided factory workers with spoiled food. They work 12 to 15 hours per day and only get paid $70 per month on the average. In many instances, they do not get paid, have no health or social security insurance, are fined for getting sick, and receive insufficient compensation if injured at work. They do not have the right to found independent labor unions to protect themselves.
Con gái tôi cùng Nguyễn Hoàng Quốc Hùng, Đoàn Huy Chương và nhiều người khác đã đến giúp đỡ công nhân đấu tranh với giới chủ, bảo vệ các quyền tối thiểu của họ, nhưng cả ba người đều đã bị nhà nước Cộng sản Việt Nam bắt, đánh đập và kết án nặng nề. Trước đây, luật sư Lê Thị Công Nhân và nhiều người khác tham gia thành lập nghiệp đoàn độc lập đã bị kết án nhiều năm tù. Riêng Lê Trí Tuệ đã trốn chạy sang Campuchia, xin cao ủy tị nạn Liên Hợp Quốc che chở, vẫn bị công an Việt Nam sang bắt đi mất tích. Đến nay đã được 6 năm.
My daughter, Đỗ Thị Minh Hạnh, and her two friends, Nguyễn Hoàng Quốc Hùng and Đoàn Huy Chương, along with others who sympathize with the desperate situation of these factory workers, helped the workers to defend their basic rights, but all three were arrested, beaten, and given severe sentences. Before them, attorney Lê Thị Công Nhân and those attempting to form independent labor unions had been sentenced to long prison terms. Particularly, Lê Trí Tuệ had to flee to Cambodia to seek the protection of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, but he was reportedly abducted by the Vietnamese police and has disappeared for the past 6 years.
Con tôi bị bắt vào ngày 23 tháng 2 năm 2010 tại Di Linh, Lâm Đồng. Tại đây, tôi đã chứng kiến công an bắt và đánh con tôi bể miệng, chảy máu đầy mặt, sau đó đưa đi biệt giam 8 tháng tại Bộ Công an rồi mới đem ra xét xử.
My daughter was arrested on February the 23rd, 2010 in Di Linh, Lâm Đồng province, and I witnessed the police beat her, causing serious injuries to her mouth and bleeding all over her face. She was later put in solitary confinement for 8 months at a facility belonging to the Department of Public Security before being brought to trial.
Phiên tòa lần thứ nhất vào ngày 26 tháng 10 năm 2010 tại Trà Vinh. Con tôi cùng 2 người bạn không có luật sư bảo chữa và công an đánh đập tàn nhẫn con tôi trước sân tòa. Cả ba bạn trẻ bị kết án, Hùng 9 năm tù giam, Trương và Hạnh mỗi người 7 năm tù giam. Giữa tháng 3 năm 2011, Công an trại giam Trà Vinh đã cho tù nhân hình sự đánh đập con tôi tại phòng giam. Tháng 4 năm 2011, khi chuyển trại giam từ Trà Vinh về Long An, con tôi đã bị còng tay, xích chân, bịt miệng và bị đánh đập trong xe thùng chở tù. Ngày 6 tháng 5 năm 2011, con tôi lại bị chuyển về Bình Thuận. Tại đây con tôi bị chuyển qua nhiều phân trại giam. Công an cưỡng bức con tôi làm cá xuất khẩu. Con tôi liên tục phản đối cưỡng bức lao động trong nhà tù. Cuối tháng 4 năm 2013, con tôi bị chuyển đến trại giam Đồng Nai. Con tôi cũng bị cưỡng bức làm hạt điều xuất khẩu. Con tôi đã phản đối việc cưỡng bức lao động và ngược đãi tù nhân, thì bị công an cho nhiều tù nhân hình sự đánh con tôi cùng một lúc. Trong đó một lần bị đánh khi đang tắm không mảnh vải che thân. Hậu quả là con tôi đã đau đầu, thần kinh đầu. Con tôi bị teo và đau nhức một bên ngực trái và có khối u trong ngực, nhưng nhà tù không cho điều trị chuyên khoa. Để uy hiếp tinh thần của con tôi và gia đình tôi, ngày 2 tháng 10 năm 2013, công an chuyển con tôi cùng với nữ tù nhân tôn giáo Mai Thị Dung từ Đồng Nai đến Thanh Xuân, Hà Nội. Trên đoạn đường dài hơn 1.700 km, cả hai đang vẫn bị trói tay, xích chân trong thùng xe như những con vật, và họ đã bị ngất xỉu nhiều lần. Từ khi con tôi bị bắt giam cho đến nay, công an luôn ép buộc con tôi nhận tội để được khoan hồng, nhưng con tôi không chấp thuận.
At the first instance trial by the Provincial Court of Trà Vinh on October 26, 2010, my daughter and her two fellow activists had no defense lawyer, and I saw the police beat her again, brutally in the court's yard. They received heavy sentences, Home 9 years, Trương and my daughter each 7 years of imprisonment. In March 2011, the Trà Vinh Province Police let common criminals beat my daughter up badly. In April 2011, while being transferred to Long An, she was handcuffed, her legs shackled, and her mouth gagged. She was beaten during the journey. On May 6, 2011, she was transferred to Bình Thuận and moved through different camps. There, my daughter repeatedly opposed forced labor imposed on her. At the end of April 2013, my daughter was transferred to Dong Nai province, where she was forced to process cashew nuts, and she opposed that as well. When she protested against forced labor and mistreatment of other prisoners, the police let a number of criminal inmates physically assault her. Once, she was beaten while taking a shower and being all naked. Due to those beatings, she suffered nervous pain. In addition, her left breast became atrophied and the pain was severe. But the prison administration did not allow her to see specialists for medical treatment. To intimidate my daughter and our family, on October 2nd, 2013, the government transferred my daughter and a religious prisoner, Mrs. Mai Thị Dung, from Dong Nai to Thanh Xuân, Hanoi. On this long journey of more than 1,700 kilometers, both of them, despite being seriously ill, were handcuffed and shackled in the van like animals. They lost consciousness several times. Since her arrest, the police has pressured my daughter to admit to having committed crimes as condition for leniency, but she has refused.
Thưa quý vị, bao năm nay, Đảng Cộng sản Việt Nam đã lừa dối cả thế giới, lừa dối Liên Hiệp Quốc và cả chính phủ Mỹ về vấn đề công nhân và lao động tại nước chúng tôi. Tổng Liên đoàn Lao động Việt Nam hiện nay là do Đảng Cộng sản thành lập. Tất cả các cấp lãnh đạo đều là đảng viên Đảng Cộng sản. Chủ tịch là ông Đặng Ngọc Tùng, Ủy viên Trung ương Đảng Cộng sản. Mục đích của họ là để giám sát và kiểm tỏa công nhân, giúp đảng khai thác bóc lột công nhân. Từ năm 1995 đến nay, đã có gần 5.000 cuộc đình công của công nhân. Những cuộc đình công đó do công nhân tự tổ chức, dưới sự hướng dẫn và giúp đỡ của những người hoạt động nghiệp đoàn bí mật. Công đoàn Nhà nước Việt Nam không đứng về phía họ, ngược lại còn cho công an đàn áp, bắt giam những người tổ chức đình công.
Ladies and gentlemen, for all these years, the Vietnamese Communist Party has deceived the world, deceived the United Nations and also the United States about workers and labor unions in my country. Vietnam General Confederation of Labor, VGCL, was established by the Vietnamese Communist Party. Its entire leadership is composed of communist members. Its president, Mr. Đặng Ngọc Tùng, is a member of the Vietnamese Communist Party's Central Committee. VGCL's purpose is to monitor and control the workers and help the party to take advantage of them and exploit them. Since 1995, there has been close to 5,000 strikes by workers. These strikes were organized by the workers themselves without the guidance of the labor organizers who operate, with the guidance of labor organizers who operate secretly. The labor union set up by the government has never been on their side. On the contrary, they provided information to the public security police to crack down and arrest the leaders or workers who organized the strikes.
Hiện nay, có hàng trăm tù nhân lương tâm đang sống trong địa ngục trần gian tại các nhà tù Cộng sản Việt Nam như con gái tôi, như nhà sáng lập Công nông Đoàn kết Đoàn Huy Chương, sinh viên Nguyễn Hoàng Quốc Hùng, linh mục Nguyễn Văn Lý, mục sư Nguyễn Công Chính, blogger Nguyễn Bắc Hải, tiến sĩ cụ Huy Hà Vũ, doanh nhân Trần Huỳnh Duy Thức, luật sư Lê Quốc Quân, sinh viên Đinh Nguyên Kha, tín đồ Mai Thị Dung, tín đồ Nguyễn Văn Lĩa, nhà báo Tạ Phong Tần, cựu chiến binh Nguyễn Hữu Cầu, dân oan Trần Thủy Thủy, v.v. Tôi xin cung cấp cho Ủy hội Nhân quyền Lantos danh sách gần 600 tù nhân chính trị và tôn giáo kèm theo. Danh sách tù nhân này do cả cựu tù nhân chính trị và thân nhân, bạn bè các tù nhân cung cấp thông tin. Với danh sách các tù nhân này, tôi mong được quý vị và các tổ chức nhân quyền trên toàn thế giới quan tâm đến họ, cũng giống như con tôi vậy.
Presently in Vietnam, there are hundreds of prisoners of conscience who live in hell on earth. That is what prisons in Vietnam truly are, like my daughter. They are United Farmers and Workers Organization member Đoàn Huy Chương, college student Nguyễn Hoàng Quốc Hùng, Reverend Nguyễn Văn Lý, Pastor Nguyễn Công Chính, journalist Nguyễn Văn Hải, Dr. Cù Huy Hà Vũ, businessman Trần Huỳnh Duy Thức, attorney Lê Quốc Quân, college student Đinh Nguyên Kha, person of faith Nguyễn Văn Lĩa, journalist Tạ Phong Tần, South Vietnamese veteran Nguyễn Hữu Cầu, victim of justice Mai Thị Dung, on and on. I would like to present to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission the list of some 600 political and religious prisoners as attachments. These lists have been compiled by advocates in Vietnam and family members of those prisoners themselves. And with that list, I hope that this commission will mobilize the world to work on getting them, set them free unconditionally.
Tôi biết đã có nhiều tổ chức quốc tế đến Việt Nam để thị sát cuộc sống của giới công nhân, nơi giam giữ tù nhân. Các tổ chức ấy đã bị nhà nước Việt Nam lừa gạt bằng cách chuẩn bị sẵn một số nhà trọ của công nhân, nhà ngục của tù nhân rất tiện nghi sạch sẽ, huấn luyện một số công nhân và tù nhân, nói về phái đoàn các nước những lời tốt đẹp nhưng dối trá về điều kiện ăn ở, làm việc tại nước Cộng hòa xã hội chủ nghĩa Việt Nam.
I know that there are many international organizations coming to Vietnam to inspect the living conditions of workers and the detention conditions of prisoners. These organizations have been deceived by the Vietnamese government, which prepare some nice and comfortable living compounds for workers and some clean cells for prisoners just for show, and train a number of workers and inmates to speak highly but deceitfully about the workplace or prison conditions in the Socialist Republic of Vietnam.
Ít ai biết rằng đằng sau bức tường được trang trí xinh đẹp là địa ngục khủng khiếp của tù nhân. Hàng trăm nhà tù to lớn trải dài khắp trên đất nước Việt Nam là những công xưởng sản xuất hàng hóa xuất khẩu như hạt điều, hàng thủ công mỹ nghệ. Người tù làm việc không được đạt chỉ tiêu sẽ bị biệt giam hay bị trừng phạt. Cai tù và nhà tù ngày càng giàu thêm nhờ việc bóc lột những người bị giam giữ.
Few people are aware that behind the beautifully decorated walls is the living hell that prisoners must face. Hundreds of prisons spreading throughout the country are factories producing goods for export, including cashew nuts and handicraft products. Prisoners do not meet the quota, are sent to solitary confinement or punished. Prison wardens and authorities have become increasingly wealthy by exploiting detainees.
Tôi rất ngạc nhiên và cảm thấy chua chát khi nghe các phát biểu của nhiều chính khách, các bảng điều trần của một số chính phủ, một số tổ chức ca ngợi nhà cầm quyền Cộng sản Việt Nam đang có tiến bộ về nhân quyền, về chính sách tôn giáo, về chế độ lao động.
I'm very surprised and feel bitter when hearing statements by politicians, reports by a number of governments and organizations that laud the Vietnamese government for its progress on human rights, its policies towards religions and labor conditions.
Kính thưa quý vị, tôi hiểu quyền lợi kinh tế quốc gia đối với nước Mỹ là tối thượng. Nhưng đối với chúng tôi, nước Mỹ cũng là tấm gương tranh đấu cho nhân quyền. Vì vậy mà tôi có được hôm nay tại nơi đây.
Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that economic interests are of top priority for the United States. However, in my eyes, the United States is also the role model in the fight for human rights. That's exactly why I'm present here today.
Tôi thỉnh cầu quý vị, bằng vị thế của mình, xin hãy dùng mọi cách để áp lực với nhà nước Cộng sản Việt Nam, trả tự do vô điều kiện cho con tôi và tất cả những tù nhân lương tâm. Nhất là trong khi Hoa Kỳ đang thương thảo hiệp ước đối tác xuyên Thái Bình Dương TPP với nhà cầm quyền Cộng sản Việt Nam.
I respectfully pray to you that, from your vantage point, please use all means to pressure the Communist government of Vietnam to unconditionally release my daughter and all prisoners of conscience, especially as the U.S. is negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership TPP with the Communist government of Vietnam.
Tôi cũng tha thiết thỉnh cầu quý vị giúp đỡ tôi kịp thời can thiệp với nhà nước Cộng sản Việt Nam, cho gia đình tôi bảo lãnh con tôi ra ngoài để đến bệnh viện điều trị căn bản mà chúng tôi nghĩ với triệu chứng ung thư đã phát hiện có khối u trong ngực trái của con tôi. Độ thì Minh Hạnh.
I also respectfully request your intervention to get the Vietnamese government to allow my daughter to be released from medical treatment because she got diagnosed with breast cancer.
Xin cảm ơn quý vị. Nguyện cầu Thượng Đế chúc lành cho Hoa Kỳ và cho quý vị.
Thank you, and may God bless the United States of America and all of you.
Thank you very much.
Just out of curiosity, is there anybody here from the administration, State Department here? You are? Good. Have you been absorbing all of this? Okay, and we'll make sure you get all of the testimony so you can share it with the secretary. If you can, I don't need your name now, but if you can just give your name to a member of my staff so we can get it to you, the transcripts. Thank you. Finally, is Gail Beckerman, a journalist who wrote the book, When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone, The Epic Struggle to Save Soviet Jewry. As I said, I read it over the Christmas break, and it was very powerful. And so I want to hear what you have to say, but I think a lot of the ideas, and I wrote a lot of notes, could almost be applied to all of these cases here.
Yeah.
And so you might, I don't know what you're going to tell us, but as you explain how you built this movement, this movement was built up, leading to the release of Sharansky and all. But if you have not read the book, I would encourage you to go out and get the book. But why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you so much, and it's such a great honor to have been invited by the Commission, and I want to thank Congressman Wolf in particular for taking such a great interest in the book and thinking that I would have something to contribute here today. On a spring day in Manhattan in 1964, 50 years ago this coming May, the very first protest on behalf of Soviet Jewry took place. A group of about 1,000 well-dressed college students, the boys in black suits and thin dark ties and the girls in dresses, lined up in 2 rows in front of the Soviet mission to the United Nations and began marching and chanting. In their seriousness, one could feel an echo of the protests then taking place for civil rights down south. But the cause they were supporting was in many ways an abstract one, not one roiling their own society. They were demanding of the Soviet Union to allow its Jews to be allowed to have some kind of Jewish identity, and if that was not possible, to let them immigrate from a country that normally did not give its citizens any right to freely leave. So what motivated them to argue for the rights of these distant Jews, far away on the other side of the Iron Curtain, people who they had never met and at that point could not even communicate with? 2 factors. First, these protesters were young people whose parents were racked with guilt for not having done enough to stop the Holocaust. Then just 2 decades passed. This inherited feeling of shame motivated the children. The student group who planned that first march, they were called the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, had a simple chant for that day's event in 1964, "History shall not repeat." So, at one level, this protest emerged out of a feeling of obligation to one's brethren, Jews who felt they needed to help other Jews for the most tribal of reasons. But there was another motivating factor. These students were offended by the Soviet Union's violation of basic human rights, its abrogation of the right to religious freedom and the right to leave one's country, which are both enshrined in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they were tapping into a generational desire to make change. Some of these protesters, some of these students would soon leave the streets of Manhattan that summer of 1964 and try to register African-American voters in Mississippi. So the particular and the universal. These were the 2 intertwined factors that pushed these students to take up the cause, and it was the engine that I think propelled this movement forward. The tribal motivation to help one's own, overlapping with the fundamental desire for freedom shared by all humanity, the particular and the universal. And this wonderful overlap is what made the Soviet Jewry movement one of the most effective human rights struggles in history. That small protest of students eventually became a mass struggle. It led to the groundbreaking Jackson-Vanik Amendment, passed in 1974, the first real piece of American legislation that directly linked our foreign policy to a country's human rights record. Broadly supported by Congress, the amendment forced the Soviets to allow for the free immigration of Jews if they wanted most favored nation trading status with the United States. By the 1980s, as other people have mentioned, no summit meeting between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev could take place without President Reagan first presenting a list of Soviet Jews who had been waiting sometimes 2 decades to get out, stuck in limbo, refuseniks as they were known, not allowed to work and yet ostracized and branded parasites by Soviet society. And by 1987, as some of you might know, when Gorbachev made his first visit to the United States, that small protest that had turned into 250,000 people who stood on the mall, including most of the Soviet Jewry leaders, Soviet Jewish leaders like Mr. Sharansky, who by that point had been allowed to leave. The struggle was successful because it was fought at these 2 different registers. It was a personal, emotional endeavor for American Jews, eager to redeem themselves from their perceived passivity, to erase the stain. But they also knew how to embed this tribal motivation within a much larger frame, to speak in the language of American values of freedom and human dignity, and to believe that they were not only fighting for their own, but also for universal principles of how people everywhere should be treated. And I think this is the central lesson of the movement for human rights struggles today. American Jews were, of course, not unique in their desire to get their countrymen to care about the plight of their brethren. There are Korean Americans who worry that the hunger and oppression of relatives trapped in North Korea is being ignored, Iranian Americans who want a foreign policy that includes more support for dissident groups, Syrian Americans who want U.S. arms to support the resistance to Bashar al-Assad. For these groups and many others trapped by what might seem to some like the parochialism of their individual causes, whether they be ethnic, religious, or national, the Soviet Jewry movement should be an example that the small interests of these groups can be elevated when they voice their concerns in an American tongue, using the language of self-evident freedoms that resonate with all of us. This will often mean negotiating the tension between tribal imperatives and common ones and finding that overlap. It's not easy or obvious, but that's where the power exists to move public opinion, to move governments, and to amplify a community's concerns until they are shared by as wide a circle as possible. Looking for this overlap also forces activists to present their cases and build grassroots support by appealing to the most elemental human impulse to relate to other people in trouble. One of the great innovations of the Soviet Jewry movement was its ability to personalize and individualize the struggle. My own first contact with the movement was as a 13-year-old, when I was twinned by a Soviet Jewry organization with a young boy from Leningrad whose family had been trying to emigrate for 8 years without success. I was given a brief synopsis of his story, a photograph, and an address. At that point, the movement stopped being large and impersonal, but about my sense of connection with this one young boy. That same spirit of humanizing the struggle extended to all its activism, from the focus on individual prisoners like Mr. Sharansky, to letter writing, wearing bracelets with the names of refuseniks, and for the most committed, actual visits to the Soviet Union to meet the dissidents. From those early days in the 1960s, there was always a sense that the movement was sustained by a grassroots of activists, thousands of people who were willing to volunteer their time and energy for the cause as if their own identities depended on it. This, too, is an important lesson for human rights campaigners. It's not enough to write reports and issue press releases about abuses unless a cause is made concrete, unless it finds a way to animate people, not just intellectually, but also emotionally. It can never move into the realm of actuality. What was so powerful about the Soviet Jewry movement is that it made this leap. It was never just an abstraction. Americans were made to understand, as any successful human rights movement must make people see, that these violations affected all of us in some way. The story of a political prisoner locked up for her beliefs has to be framed as a personal affront to a set of values in order for her cause to ignite others. That's what I saw in those letters from that young boy in Leningrad, a personal affront to my growing sense then of the basic freedoms that any human being should enjoy. It seemed preposterous to me that he and his family couldn't just leave if they wanted to. So creating those small moments of sympathy, I believe, have to be at the heart of any struggle. Then the job of transforming that sentiment into action can begin. No amount of lobbying can be effective before that happens. The intertwining of the particular and the universal. Having examined closely the Soviet Jewry movement, this was the formula that accounts for its success. Its redemptive power for those individuals who made up its activist ranks, combined with the appeal to larger principles that were impossible for Americans to turn away from. It's a formula that I believe still very much has relevance today for those human rights activists frustrated at being ignored and eager to find a way to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Smith and then Mr. Lowenthal. I just wanted to say I think you're exactly right. And for all of the different groups, this place is downstream for what is going on out here. This place will, if you think the Congress and the administration will save you, you are mistaken. Unless we have a rare individual like Ronald Reagan who had this in every fiber of him. But Senator Jackson, if you read the book, went out and developed this, and then Washington began to hear. And so I think this is really a model for how we go back and capture and working together, if you will, the gulags in Korea, in North Korea. When this government in North Korea falls, America will feel guilty if it doesn't do something for what's taking place. In Vietnam, we can just go around. But I think I urge those who are interested, just read this book because it sort of lays out a history which I had experienced, but I never sort of quite saw it. So I want to go to Mr. Smith and Mr. Lowenthal. Before I do that, if I can, someone just said there are parents of Sino-Vietnamese prisoners in the audience. If they could just stand up, if they're here, and give me the name of their child. If you can interpret, Doctor, could you interpret? Just so
Yes.
they can give us their name
Yes.
and their child.
I'm Nguyễn Thị Trâm, the mother of attorney Lê Quốc Quân. I'm here to ask for help to get my son out of prison.
Any other, is there, no? And we could get both of their names to the staff, so we're able to. And I just urge you, you ought to just give this cable to the American ambassador in Vietnam. I mean, if this does not move him and the story of this mother, he should be gone, just like that. If it does not, so if you can maybe stay so you can take the names of both of these parents back and in the case with that, Mr. Smith and then Mr. Lantos.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I think the witnesses today have just eloquently summed up the plight of dissidents. They spoke about individuals and did so, I think, so passionately. But it is a tip of the iceberg for everyone who we spoke about or they spoke about today. There are thousands of others who are suffering an equal fate of harassment, torture, and gross mistreatment. So it is, the time really has come for a reevaluation at the White House. I would say, with all due respect to the President of the United States, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, it remains unbelievable to me, and I think many others, that in meeting after meeting, he does not publicly speak out on behalf of Liu Xiaobo, Gao Zhejiang, and all the other individuals in China who are being beaten and tortured, as Gung Hu just went through and explained to us afresh, the gross mistreatment, the barbaric mistreatment. People who do those things against innocent and totally idealistic attorneys like Gao Zhejiang, the people who do it and order it are deranged. They're the kind of people, I mean, there's a pathology there that is sickening. We saw it in the Soviet Union, the people who mistreated Natan Sharansky and so many others during the worst days of the Gulag state there. So the ineffective and inadequate attention to political dissidents, again, as the means of reform, if we pay attention to them, the other reforms will follow, and it's not the other way around. Enabling. And that's what we are doing now so callously. Maybe it's done naively, but I would suggest it might even be to the point of being callous. How many times do you have to hear these stories and not change your modus operandi? You know, the Vietnam Human Rights Act, as I think as many of you know, has passed the House. It has passed overwhelmingly. It was totally bipartisan. It is the third time in 3 different Congresses we've been able to get that legislation passed. Okay, thank you. It does provide a roadmap with specific benchmarks for human rights reform, and yet it is languishing right nearby in the Senate, and I will bet, maybe my salary, it will not come up for a vote again in the United States Senate. So to Harry Reid, I make an appeal. Put the bill up to Senator Menendez. Put the bill up for a vote. Its conditionality is so modest, freezing the foreign aid, which is U.S. grant money to the government of Vietnam at the last year's levels, is modest indeed, but it lays out a roadmap for reform. Vietnam, at least the people who are behind Block 8406 and all of the other human rights activists and Dr. Tong, and I would say publicly, who helped us draft that bill. It's an idea whose time has come. So we can talk about human rights, and my good friend and colleague from California, one of the co-sponsors, of course, Mr. Frank Wolf, a co-sponsor. All of us are saying, let's be serious about this. So the Vietnam Human Rights Act, Mrs. Tron, needs to pass. It will help. It'll help daughters, it'll help husbands, wives, and family members. And let me just say, Ms. Grace Gao, as you know so well, who testified on December 5th at a hearing that was focused on the 5 daughters who spoke out to Beijing, but equally spoke out to the White House. I mean, we're the legislative branch. We are not the face of foreign policy. That is an executive branch function, as we all know. We write the laws. We put the money or don't put money into certain accounts. But when it comes to the interface with foreign governments, we can be advocates, and we are. But it is the White House. It is the diplomats who carry the burden or drop that burden for the dissidents. And I would respectfully submit, we wrote a letter to the President of the United States asking that your daughter and the other 4 daughters be allowed to meet with the President to make their case on behalf of their fathers. We haven't even gotten a response back from the White House. That's unconscionable to me. Let me also say that Grace summed up something that I think we often miss, and that is it's not just the prisoner of conscience who suffers so horrifically, but it's all of the circle of family and friends who are in anguish over their daily mistreatment, as you are, and as you have stated so eloquently in the past, as you have done so today. As Grace pointed out, when she would go to school, when you folks were still in China, 6 or 7 policemen would escort her to school, mock her father in the car, make life absolutely miserable for her as well as for the rest of the family. She says, all of my relatives, such as my grandma, grandpa, 3 aunts, and his brother and sisters, are blacklisted. They're deprived of basic rights. And then she goes on, 8 years have passed. The persecution of my father is not only still continuing, but also extends to all of our family members. So they're in the gulag too, suffering that anguish. And I think we have to be much more attentive to that than we have been. And she too, she goes, I wish the staffs of the U.S. Embassy in China would at least go and visit my father in prison. Hop in a car and go see him. And if you're rebuffed and turned down, make a big deal about it. It is the indifference, as was mentioned by Robbie George earlier, it is enabling to dictatorships, and we need to speak out much more effectively. Let me just say, too, and it was mentioned by the co-chair earlier, Mr. McGovern, you know, Frank Wolf has been a champion, a leader. The Religious Freedom Act is the law of our land, although it's not being implemented by this administration, but it was written by this man right here. And I have to tell you, the pushback, we were told it would create a hierarchy of human rights by the Assistant Secretary for Democracy and Human Rights, John Shattuck, when he testified before my committee against the Wolf bill. Here's the point person for human rights saying, we don't want the law, we don't want the bill. And thankfully, when it was finally presented with overwhelming bipartisan support in the House and the Senate, because of Mr. Frank Wolf's lead, it was signed by President Clinton, even though he opposed it throughout the entire process. So we're glad to get the signature. But then it has not been effectively implemented. And I think that's why we have to redouble our efforts. We're going to miss you, Frank. I still hope he'll reconsider. He has been a stalwart in combating religious persecution and for speaking out on behalf of prisoners of conscience. Today's hearing is another iteration of that concern and that compassion and that empathy, and we need to redouble our efforts on behalf of all of you and all the others that you speak for today, including in countries that are not here today. We all know which countries they are, and they too will get their place at the witness panel, but we've got to redouble our efforts. And this administration has to stop, however unwittingly that it's doing it, its enabling of dictatorship.
Well, again, thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Co-Chair, for holding this hearing, and Congressman Smith for your leadership in especially highlighting the human rights violations in Vietnam. I want to thank all the members of the panel for coming today and to sharing their stories and their advocacy on behalf of prisoners of conscience who are unable to speak for themselves. It is through your voice that we in the Congress can begin to act. It's deeply troubling to hear all of the human rights abuses from all around the world, but I believe it is our opportunity as members of Congress to renew our commitment to shining a spotlight wherever there are prisoners of conscience, wherever they are, and where they're being held without cause and without losing their rights and their individual liberties. I want to especially thank Ms. Tran for her brave testimony. Through the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, I have adopted Mr. Nguyen Tien Trung, who, much like your daughter, has been imprisoned by the Vietnamese government solely for expressing her beliefs. Thank you again for reminding us of the ongoing unacceptable violation of human rights in Vietnam. And for myself, I want to thank you for reminding us that as this Congress addresses the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we should not be rewarding nations that trample on human rights by providing them enhanced privileges. I thank you for bringing that up. It is something that we must continue to address, and I appreciate all of you for being here. Thank you.
So we're going to end with showing a film. Where is the film going to? There's going to be a film. It's a very short. I think it's a 5-minute film.
I'll see you in a few minutes.
Я Марина Адамович, жінка Миколи Статкевича, былого кандидата у президенти Білорусі, який був арештований 19 снежня 2010 года, у день выборов, осуджена до 6 годов колонии узмоцненного режиму. Для нас вельмі важна міжнародная солідарнасць, яна вельмі важная для нас, для сваякоў, бо дазваляе нам не адчуваць себе пакінутымі. Яна вельмі важная для наших хлопцаў, таму што не дазваляе рэжыму проста расправіцца з імі, калі да іх прыцягнута ўвага. І мы вельмі удзячныя за цвёрдую пазіцыю і вельмі просім, каб цвёрдая пазіцыя Злучаных Штатаў працягвала заставацца такой жа цвёрдай. Мы просім вас принять усе можливые меры международного впливу на белорусский режим. Дзеля того, каб не толькі наши близкие были на волі, але і краіна была вольнай. І перш за ўсё, конечно, рэч ідзе аб санкцыях, перш за ўсё эканамічных, якіх рэжым вельмі баіцца.
With that, Grant, I want to thank all of the
እስክንድር ጋር በቃ ከመጨረሻዋ ቀን ስንብት በኋላ ተገናኘችን አላውቅም ታየችን አላውቅም መንገዱም የለም ለእስክንድር ነው መልእክት ማስተላለፈው አንተ ብታልፍም ራአይ ሃያልፍም ለህዝብ ለሀገር ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ዲሞክራሲ ሐሳብን በነጻነት የመግለጽ መብት እንዲከበር ነው መስዋዕት ይሆንከው መስዋዕትነትህ ዋጋ አለው በርታ ነው ማለት በቃ እንግዲህ እስክንድር ሲታሰር የመጀመሪያው አይደለም የገባበትን ምክንያት ያው እስክንድር ማንንም እንደሚያውቀው ጸሐፊ ነው ጋዜጠኛ ነው በየጊዜው መንግስትን ይተቻል ሌላ ምንም ምክንያት የለም የተከሰሰበት ግን ከሱ ጋር ማይወክለው ከሱሙ ጋር ማይሄድ አሸባሪ ተብሎ ነው እስክንድር ጋዜጠኛ ነው አሸባሪ አይደለም ምንም ነገር ማለፍም አይችል ነገ እታሰራለሁ ነገ ሌላ ነገር ይደርስብኛል ብሎ ዛሬን ከመጻፍ ወደ ኋላ ማይል አላመጣም ነገ ውጤት አላመጣም አይደለም ውጤት ያመጣል በርቱ ጠንክሩ ኢትዮጵያ ላይ ያላችሁ ትኩረት አሁንም ይቀጥል ነው ማለት ሌሎችም የታሰሩ እንደ እስክንድር አይነት ሌሎችም ጋዜጠኞች ላይ የምታረጉትን ነገር ይቀጥል ጥረታችን ውጤት አላመጣም አትበሉ ተስፋ አትቁረጡ ውጤት ያመጣል በርቱ ነው ማለት
Kính thưa quý vị, tôi là Võ Văn Bửu, chồng của tù nhân lương tâm Mai Thị Dung, hiện đang bị giam tại thủ đô Hà Nội, Việt Nam, cách nhà tôi 2.000 cây số. Vợ tôi đang mang các chứng bệnh hiểm nghèo mà không được đưa đi chữa trị hơn 7 năm nay. Lần thăm cách đây 2 tuần, vợ tôi đi không nổi, phải nhờ người dìu. Vợ tôi tay chân bị sưng, phù, tóc rụng gần hết. Vợ tôi bị giam giữ về đối xử dã man vô nhân đạo, chỉ vì đấu tranh đòi quyền tự do trên tôn giáo, giáo Hòa Hảo mà bị xử tù 11 năm vì tội gây rối trật tự công cộng. Rất mong quý vị hãy cứu giúp vợ tôi, nếu không vợ tôi sẽ phải bị chết trong tù. Xin chân thành cảm ơn.
Thank you, Chairman Wu, Chairman McGovern, and other members of the Commission for allowing me to speak on behalf of my son, as well as Lê Quốc Quân and Đinh Nguyên Kha, whose mothers are sitting right here next to me. We are here because our sons remained in prison in Vietnam. We asked for your intervention because our son did nothing wrong other than exercising the freedom of speech. Yet, my son, Trần Duy Thích, was sentenced to 16 years in prison and 5 years under house arrest. His trial lasted less than 1 day. We therefore appeal to the Commission to request the Vietnamese government to allow you to visit our sons and other prisoners of conscience in Vietnam. If your request is denied, please make it a condition upon the signing of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. As a member of the Vietnam Path Movement, one of many civil society organizations set up recently in Vietnam, I urge you to help us with the capacity building, training, so that our people will be empowered to advocate for changes and for the release of all prisoners of the conscience in Vietnam. Thank you very much for your attention to this matter.
İnsan Hakkı Müdafiəçi, Toluşa Sadıq Qəzet Baş Redaktor, Fizika Riyaziyyat Elmlər Namizədi Hilal Mammadov, Ostoro rayonunda Toluş folklor tədbiri davordini, Yanaça in tədbiri video YouTube-da Noybapeş, Çay qırğısı Saygora, Şestor türmədən iştirakası ərizə əsasən və təqib yəm təzyiqə məruz var. Aşağı qategoriya polis, 20 iyun 2012 sonrada Başay Çift, yəm mənzil narkotika şodoşu, soxta protokol tərdif kardeşi və narkotika havoti iddiam işdoy. Dımına kifayətlənmiş növün Daruş Bapeşdə və həmin türmədən iştirakası ərizəsindən əlavə Dıqla soxdu və davləti xəyanət, milli jovijniyyəti eğandı qona iddiamış doğaşını. Məhkəmə real vəziyyəti ictimaiyyəti ki, New York'a qora məqsədi şəkildə qapalı və hilalı pensor koduşu. Məlum ki, narkotika, yəni şpiyonəti bəyandı tamamilə ziddi. Deto basa dünya tarixədə jago qıla şey təsadüf bəni ki, şpiyon həmən də narkotika məşğul oldu. Hələm dünya kriminallığı tarixədə jagna şey bəni. Ön tamam absurdu, amma hüquq müdafiə təşkilatının ki, yəni ABŞ Davlət Departamenti hilali azadiyəti yardım kartı qıra xahiş qardamın. Və şuma həməni deyilə hörməti Hilal Məmmədov ailənumi ki, Səbadi Məmmədov.
Everyone on the videos were adopted by members and are part of the Defending Freedom project. Secondly, Mr. Smith and Dr. Tong wanted me to announce that they're going to have a press conference at 1:45 in Rayburn 2255, whereby they will release